Hello and welcome to Niche References, where I yap about my niche interests so that I don't annoy my friends and family with them. If you're listening to this via podcast, this will also be posted on YouTube, and the link to that will be somewhere in the description show notes. I'm not entirely sure how this works yet. And similarly, if you're watching this on YouTube, the visuals will be minimal throughout all this. So if you would rather listen to it in podcast form, I will leave a link to the podcast episode or feed down in the description of the YouTube video if you would rather listen to it that way. My name is Chris, and today I'm going to be reviewing Nancy Drew and the Mystery of the Seven Keys, the highly anticipated 34th game in the Nancy Drew Adventure series, which just released a couple of weeks ago. I've been so excited for this game to come out, but I also was trying not to get my hopes up because of Midnight in Salem, and also some weird marketing choices and some sketchy release decisions that Her Interactive was making. I started playing the game almost immediately after it was released, and I finished it the day after, and I've taken some time to collect my thoughts after finishing the game, and I'm now ready to share those thoughts. So like a lot of Nancy Drew fans, I'm a massive nerd, and I have a Google Doc that has, I think, an excess of 150 pages now, where I just rate and review and discuss every Nancy Drew game I play every time I play a new one or replay one that I've already played. So I'm going to be sharing those ratings that I gave Mystery of the Seven Keys with you today. So I rate the games based on 7 different factors, with each factor being on a scale from 1 to 10. First, the story. Second, setting and atmosphere. Third, the cast of characters. Fourth, intuitiveness. 5, games, puzzles, minigames, etc. 6, enjoyment. And 7, personal bias. I understand that on first glance, those last 2 sound like the same thing, but they are different, and I will explain when we get to those ratings. And then I average all 7 of those factors together to give the game an average score between 1 and 10. I also typically rate the game's difficulty from 1 to 10 as well, but I don't factor that into the average score simply because the difficulty of a game does not necessarily make it better or worse, so I keep that separate. I should also note before I get into my ratings that I do take advantage of the full 10-point scale from 1 to 10 because I do score these games against each other, not against games as a whole. I say all this to say that I am not afraid of giving low ratings to these games. I have given factors 1 out of 10 before for certain games, and my lowest rated game on average is a 3.00. I do give out low ratings sometimes. You have been warned. If me being critical of these games will upset you, you might want to leave now. Okay, warning out of the way, let's jump into the game. So let's start by chatting about the story. What is this game about? Nancy is invited to Prague by a woman named Adela Cherna, who owns a necklace that's a family heirloom. She decides to sell this necklace, and in the process of trying to sell it, she discovers that the gems on it have been stolen and replaced with fraudulent gems. So she's calling in Nancy to investigate. As Nancy investigates this one heirloom, she begins to believe that this might all actually be part of a larger plot to try and steal the crown jewels of Prague. So Nancy Drew fans love when like a historical mystery and a modern mystery weave together in one of these games, and I think that's what Her Interactive was going for with this one. Granted, there's not really a historical mystery going on here, but there's certainly a lot about the history of Prague and how it's influencing modern Prague and our modern mystery. Overall, I think that these aspects were woven together fairly well. I do think that there were some plot conveniences and a few things that I couldn't quite follow logically, but I don't think that they were particularly heinous. Overall, I think my score for the story of the game is going to be a 6 out of 10, which is middle of the road but leaning positive. Basically, I think it's good, not great. I think that the history of Prague was really interesting and I loved how it wove into the modern mystery, but I don't think it was particularly outstanding or one of the more intriguing stories in the Nancy Drew series. And like I said, there were just a couple of things that made me kind of go, huh? But overall, general vibe is good, not great. Moving on to the characters, there is a fairly lengthy list of characters for this game. So our cast of characters, we have Adela, who is the one who asks Nancy to come and investigate, but who also Nancy considers to be a possible suspect because she could be wanting to get insurance money. There's also Patrizia, who works at the cafe and is friends with Adela and knows quite a bit about the history of Prague. We also have Oskar, who is the exhibit curator at the museum. There's Vladena, who owns a jewelry store in town and is friends with Adela. Then there's Marek and Elka, who are a grandfather and granddaughter duo. They own and operate Apparat, which on one side is like a modern tech store, and on the other side is the old school craftsman tinkerer side of Apparat. There's Radek, who's a puppeteer who runs the Marionette Theater. There's also Leo, who's the dean of St. Vitus Cathedral, which is the big cathedral there in the square. There's also Zane Garrett, who is a secret agent called in by the Hardy Boys to help Nancy. Speaking of the Hardy Boys, we get them as a phone contact, and we also get Ned as a phone contact. Unique to this game is that you can actually text your phone contacts as well. Unfortunately, you don't get to actually type words to them. You just get to send the messages that Nancy decides you can send. So I think that with that sheer volume of characters I just listed off, everyone was a bit concerned that her interactive was potentially spreading themselves too thin with the number of characters. And I think that kind of ended up being partially true. I'm trying not to get into spoilers in this discussion, so I'm going to be a bit vague, but I do think that there are 2 pairs of characters where each pair could have been combined into just one character to create a tighter, stronger cast overall. In my opinion, I think the most interesting character overall is Radek. I think that he just is the most well-formed, interesting character with the most characterization, if that makes sense. He just felt the most distinct and fully formed as a character to me. I also thought that the character dialogue wasn't particularly inspiring. It really was just a tool for the investigation and nothing else. Honestly, most of the conversations in this game really felt like you were having a conversation and the characters were saying things without actually saying anything, if that makes sense. And overall, it honestly just made me really miss the days of just goofy, unhinged conversations that you could have with the suspects in the past. Overall, I think I have to give the characters in this one a 5 out of 10 overall, just like right in the middle. I think there are some good aspects, some bad aspects. It ends up with it being pretty mediocre, middle of the road, 5 out of 10. So let's chat about the controls of this game, which factors into my setting and atmosphere score. So as many of us know, Her Interactive announced that there would be 2 different ways to play Mystery of the Seven Keys. One option is modern mode, which is basically just free roam, but you could also play in classic mode, which is essentially your classic point and click Nancy Drew adventure, the same way the previous games have been. And I think most of us, upon hearing that, were really excited that we were going to get classic mode because a lot of us want it to feel like the classic Nancy Drew games. We want that classic point and click adventure style. So when I started playing the game, I started on classic mode because I did want to see what the point and click style would be like for the game, and I was hoping that it would work well. Halfway through the game, I decided to switch to modern controls, and I vastly preferred the modern controls to the classic mode. I appreciate that they tried to cater to the fans by giving us a classic point and click style mode to use, but I think that the game was made for modern controls, made for free roam, and I think that the game works much, much better in that mode. In classic mode, finding hotspots to click on was really clunky, especially in large open areas or when turning, and after using the free look feature when standing still, which to be fair was also an issue in Midnight in Salem. It's not completely unplayable in classic mode, but it's clunky in comparison to even some of the oldest games in the series, so I think the attempt was made, but it was not a successful attempt. So since the controls factor into my setting and atmosphere score, let's talk about the setting and atmosphere. Overall, I kind of just wish the environments were more interactive. The old town square basically exists just to go to Apparat and maybe to look at the clock. if you feel like it. There's basically nothing else to do on that side of the map. You can just go to Apparat and you can look at the astronomical clock. That's it. And in general, several of the environments just have very few things to actually interact with. Among everything, I think the museum is the clear highlight. It's very cool. There's lots to interact with. There's a lot to read. It feels like a real museum. It was really well done. I'd also say that a lot of the big statement set pieces look really cool. The cathedral, the clock, they look cool. You can't do anything with them, but they're nice to look at. The music also factors into my setting and atmosphere score, and overall, I liked the music for this one. I think that it evokes Prague well. I think that it fits in tonally with music from the other Nancy Drew games. I do find that it's a little repetitive when they insist on tying certain songs to certain locations, and you're just stuck in a location solving a puzzle and hearing the same song over and over again. But I don't think that it was, particularly game-breaking or anything like that, or frustrating or annoying. Just, slightly repetitive. I also do appreciate that they put a lot of effort into making sure that Prague was truly central to the game, to the story, to everything. You're never going to forget that you're in Prague, and that's something that sometimes is an issue with some of the Nancy Drew games. So in the end, my rating for setting and atmosphere for Mystery of the Seven Keys is a 6 out of 10, which for me is kind of middle of the road, but leaning positive instead of negative. A lot of cool set pieces, but not as interactive as I would want it to be, so it's kind of middle of the road, but it looks nice. Oh boy. Let's chat about how intuitive this game was. So intuitiveness is a major factor to me in the Nancy Drew games, and I will discuss why in just a moment, because I feel like it's not discussed enough when it comes to these games. But first, I've got some beef with the Nancy Drew community. So after finishing this game, I hopped into the Reddit thread of people sharing their opinions on the game, and probably the most common complaint I saw repeated over and over in that thread was people saying that the game was not intuitive and required huge leaps of logic. And to that I say, I don't disagree with you, but I feel like it has been way too long since some of y'all played a Nancy Drew game for the first time. So I'm a longtime fan of these games. I've been playing them since I was a child in the early 2000s, but I only played like a small handful of them when I was younger, like a third of them, maybe. And I started playing catch-up a few years ago during lockdown in 2020. So as a fan who's played a lot of these games for the first time relatively recently as an adult, I think it's incredibly common in the Nancy Drew games for a game to be incredibly unintuitive the first time you play it. And I think a lot of people have forgotten that because it's been such a long time since they played one of these games for the first time. It is so common to be unable to progress in one of these games simply because you didn't look at this one screen or didn't pick up this one item laying on the floor that's like 5 pixels big. And because of that, you just get stuck wandering aimlessly around until you figure out what you have not triggered. And this is why intuitiveness is such a big factor to me, because I have spent so much time while playing these games just wandering around aimlessly or having no clue how a puzzle is supposed to be solved. This is not abnormal in a Nancy Drew game at all. So on the point of intuitiveness, it's important for me to point out that, in my opinion, there are 2 forms of it. The first of those is understanding what you're supposed to be doing versus wandering around aimlessly. And then secondly, for me, is understanding puzzles and what you're supposed to do to solve those puzzles. Like, can you look at a puzzle and, given the clues you have, understand how to solve it? So for this game in particular, for the first factor, I think that the game was mostly fairly solid. The first half of the game, I didn't really spend any time aimlessly wandering around trying to figure out what to do. I did struggle with this a couple of times in the second half, but I didn't find it to be too terrible. The second factor, though, understanding what puzzles actually want you to do with them, that one can be a bit rough in certain spots in this game, let me tell you. I absolutely made liberal use of the hints and the player guide. Again, mostly in the second half of the game, which I think is also fairly common in these games. Often the first half of the game will be fine, and if it's going to get impossible to follow, it will be in that second half of the game. There were a few puzzles in this game that I just found to be wholly unintuitive in how to solve them. There's one puzzle in particular in the jewelry shop that I never really fully figured out what I was supposed to do, and I think I still don't know how to solve that puzzle. I've fully cheated on that one. Everything combined, I would say that this game is fairly average on intuitiveness, but leaning toward the not intuitive side of things. So overall, my score for intuitiveness on this game is 4 out of 10. Certainly not the least intuitive Nancy Drew game I've played, but not too good either. So this leads me into the puzzles themselves. Obviously, the intuitiveness of the puzzles does affect my opinion on how good the puzzles are, but I do try to score them separately. For example, I think that the less intuitive puzzles in this game could have been fantastic puzzles if they had just been explained slightly better. But regardless, I have to rate them on the puzzles I was given, not an idealized version of the puzzles that I wish I could have gotten. Overall, I liked several puzzles in this game, but I did find myself fairly frustrated by several others. I think the overall difficulty of the puzzles in this one was fairly solid, and I think that anytime a puzzle felt too difficult, it was more due to a lack of intuitiveness or a logical leap rather than the puzzle itself being too difficult, if that makes sense. So again, that's a place where I would be docking the intuitiveness of the game versus the puzzle score. Because like I said, I think that if the intuitiveness of the puzzles had been better, if they had been explained better, the puzzles in this game could have slapped. But once again, that's an intuitiveness thing, not the puzzles themselves. I'm trying to think of what my favorite puzzle in the game would be without giving spoilers. I think it's probably the puzzle on the wall with the symbols. That's kind of a logic puzzle, and I always enjoy those. Although I think it's another puzzle that was not totally executed perfectly. I also liked the debugging puzzle that we had to do a few times with the computers. And honestly, there was a puzzle near the end game that I also really liked. Again, trying not to get into spoiler territory, but it is near the end of the game and it involves the aforementioned 7 keys. If you've played the game, I think you know what I'm talking about at this point. The puzzle factor is also where I count minigames and chores, and I do have some serious beef with the devs for the latte art, because the coffee making minigame could have been a new all-time favorite minigame for me, but the latte art ruins it for me. The latte art was just so touchy for me, and I really felt like I was back in the Ryokan Hiei trying to write my name as Nancy Drew for Takai, and I hate that so much. It's so touchy. And that's exactly how I felt while doing the latte art. I'm so bad at things like this that involve writing with my mouse. No thank you. Except in this instance, I had to do it over and over again until finally I was allowed to stop doing latte art. And then I didn't do any more coffee throughout the game because I didn't want to do the latte art, which is really disappointing because I was so excited for the coffee minigame and the latte art just ruined it for me. So overall, I'm giving the puzzles another 5 out of 10, right smack dab in the middle. I promise that most Nancy Drew games are not like this where I just keep giving middle of the road ratings on every factor, but that's just how I feel about this one. Some of the puzzles were really cool, some of them really sucked. In the end, they just kind of average out to middle of the road. Moving on to my enjoyment of the game, unfortunately we're not getting any more variety in the scores here because I'm giving it another 5 out of 10. Overall, I had a fine time playing this game. I wasn't sitting there just like frustrated the entire time, angry at it. But I also was not like super excited and having the time of my life, which given that it's a brand new Nancy Drew game and we're all hyped for the release, you'd kind of expect to be a little bit more excited and enjoying yourself a bit more while playing this. And it was fine. I had a fine time. Just because I was curious for context, I did look at my overall enjoyment scores for all of the Nancy Drew games, and giving this a 5 out of 10 does put it in the lower third of the games. Typically, I do overall enjoy myself enough to give a game at least 6 out of 10. So it does have a 5, but it is in like the bottom third of the games, which, spoiler alert, is I think kind of where it's ending up in general for me. It's kind of like the top of the bottom third of the games overall. So finally, the last factor, which is personal bias. What do I mean by this if not my enjoyment? So my personal bias score is the score I would give it if you just point blank asked me, give this game a rating from 1 to 10. Ignoring all my other ratings, one number, what is that number from 1 to 10? I call this my personal bias, but largely it's there to counteract my bias. For example, there are some games in the series that I don't personally love. They're not ones that I personally enjoy playing that much, but I recognize that they're probably better games than I give them credit for. I just don't personally like them. So my personal bias rating would be higher than my enjoyment rating, as like an I don't love you but I respect you gesture, if that makes sense. And vice versa for any games that I personally really love but also recognize I'm playing through rose-colored glasses and they're probably not actually as good as my personal enjoyment would suggest. So that's the explanation for what this rating means, but I say all of this for absolutely no reason for this one because, again, this one's getting a 5 out of 10 for personal bias. Overall, I think this is just middle of the road. I struggle to have a strong opinion on this game, honestly. I didn't actively dislike it. I didn't actively overly enjoy it. It was fine. So let's run through all 7 of the numbers that I just handed out before sharing my overall average rating. So I give it a 6 out of 10 for story, a 6 out of 10 for setting and atmosphere, a 5 out of 10 for characters, a 4 out of 10 for intuitiveness, and a 5 out of 10 for the games and puzzles, the enjoyment, and my personal bias. Averaging all 7 of those numbers out, we get a score of 5.14 out of 10, which makes sense. It's basically in line with my general opinion of the game, which is that it's kind of middle of the road. But I do want to give context to that just so you can see where that kind of falls within my overall ranking of the Nancy Drew games. So as I mentioned near the beginning, my lowest rated Nancy Drew game has an average of 3.0 out of 10. My highest rated Nancy Drew game has an average of 9.29 out of 10. So having an average of 5.14 out of 10 lands this one again just kind of at the top of that bottom third of the games. I'm trying to be vague and not give a hard and fast number because I do want to go through and do a full ranking video of all of the Nancy Drew games very soon. But yeah, it's like the top of the bottom third is essentially where I place this, kind of around 20th overall. Granted, that is based on the actual average score. I think if I were going to just gut check myself and just put them all in order, I think it would probably be a little bit lower because so many games just get that nostalgia boost. But I think as I've been saying, the top of the bottom third feels correct. It's not outright heinous like some of the worst games in the series, but it's nowhere near any of the best games in the series by far. In terms of a difficulty score for this one, I'm torn between a 7 and an 8. For me, a 7 is medium hard. For 8, it's true hard. That's what I would give a hard game in the Nancy Drew series. If I'm honest, I think, again, the intuitiveness is just what's bringing this down because I think this would be more of a medium difficulty game if not for the lack of intuitiveness. I think I'm going to go ahead and give it a 7 out of 10 for difficulty. It's medium hard, and mostly just any hard moments are due to the lack of intuitiveness. I really wish I could see what this game would be like if things were just explained a little bit better. I think that would do wonders for this game. I also have to say that something that doesn't really come up in my rating criteria at all is that Midnight in Salem often didn't really feel like you were playing a Nancy Drew game. It felt like something else entirely. to me, this did feel like I was playing a Nancy Drew game again. Obviously not like completely back to the OG Nancy Drew games, because we have a new voice actor. Obviously the engine is completely different, but it felt a lot more true to a Nancy Drew game than Midnight in Salem did, which I think is a huge step forward. And I think overall that is my opinion on this game. I think it's a big step forward for Her Interactive and the Nancy Drew games overall. I think it's a step in the positive direction. And if I were going to sum up my opinion on this game in one sentence, I'm not mad at it. I know that that's not like, heaping praise, but I'm not mad at this game. I think that overall, even though they're still making some questionable choices, like only letting us download it through their website at first and still not releasing it on Steam, I think in general they're listening to the fan base, which is definitely a positive. Overall, I think a lot of us were kind of primed to dislike this game thanks to the general direction of the series and Midnight in Salem in particular. And I've seen several people who expected to be disappointed by the game and did dislike the game. If I'm totally honest, I'm not sure I feel like some of the dislike is merited to me. I get the vibe that some of it is due to confirmation bias of people expecting to be disappointed and therefore being disappointed. I'm not here to try to invalidate other people's opinions. That's just kind of the vibe I've gotten from the general discourse. From my perspective, I'm in the subsection of the fan base that is feeling pleasantly surprised at the moment. I'm just hoping that this gets the series back on track in a more positive direction going forward. And I often find that when I replay a Nancy Drew game, the scores that I give it tend to improve as intuitiveness improves simply because I'm replaying it. So I will be interested to see what this game is like on a replay. I think that it'll end up getting a higher score from me, but I don't think it'll end up, leaping way high or anything like that. So that is it for my review of Nancy Drew Mystery of the Seven Keys. I will be back soon, probably with more Nancy Drew related content in the near future and other stuff to follow. So if you're interested to hear more of that, go ahead and subscribe to the podcast feed and or the YouTube channel wherever you're currently listening to this. My goal is for my next episode to be my ranking of all of the Nancy Drew games. I haven't decided whether I'm going to do it in a tier list format or if I'm just going to do a pure ranking of the games, but it's something that I've been wanting to do for a very long time, and I'm very excited to finally be doing it very soon. So if you are interested in hearing that or any of my other thoughts on any of my other niche interests, go ahead and click the subscribe button on whatever platform you're currently listening to this on, and comment down below letting me know your thoughts on Mystery of the Seven Keys. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Were you disappointed? Are you pleasantly surprised like me? Let me know. I'd love to hear and discuss. I have not taken the time to think of a clever outro for this, so thank you for listening to me ramble about my niche interests, and I will see you next time.